On the stage before us, we have Mark Doumit from the Washington Forest Protection Association. To his left, John Mankowski from Mankowski Environmental, Cassie Phillips, formerly from Weyerhaeuser, and Jim Peters from Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. We'll start the panels with a history about forest and fish from folks who were actually at the table. Sadly, our key negotiators, Chan, Nels, and Sherry, are no longer living or able to, so not available to participate. As an icebreaker, I just kind of start, Mark, from you. If as an icebreaker, would you kind of please describe your role in the negotiations at the time and how that has shaped what you're currently doing?
Thank you, Ken. Well, back in 1999, I was a member of the State House of Representatives. I had been county commissioner in Weyerhaeuser County, which is very natural resources, timber dependent and fish dependent county. I represented the southwest corner of the state, so I had from Aberdeen in Grays Harbor County all the way down all of Pacific County, Weyerhaeuser County, and Longview and Castle Rock in Cowlitz County. So I had timber country USA, really some of the highest producing mills in the country, one of Weyerhaeuser's cornerstone areas in the country, as well as a lot of small forest landowners. I bought my own tree farm in 1992. So I was also a tree farm and I had cattle as well on my ag land, a commercial fishing business in Alaska. So in 1999, natural resources really was my life. I was on the Natural Resources Committee. I was vice chair of the Appropriations Committee in the tie, and it was a 49-49 tie. So I think that's really important and relevant to think about compared to today's politics. The Senate had a one-vote Democratic majority, and Gary Locke was the governor. So we had a different set of circumstances than we have now. It was a very unique time because we've only had one other tie in our state's history with a tied legislature. So if it was going to get out and it was going to be a big bill like this one, this was absolutely the largest environmental bill that's passed in the last 2 decades, really. This was going to have to be worked out between Republicans and Democrats. It couldn't be a partisan vote. So as that, I was a very, I suppose, influential member of the Natural Resources Committee because I represented such a large timber-dependent and fish-dependent district. Jim Buck was the Republican co-chair. Debbie Regala was the Democratic co-chair from Tacoma. So we had Buck, who was the 24th district. He represented the Grays Harbor North and Olympic Peninsula area, so he had a lot of timber in his district. Debbie was from an urban district, but she had a lot of timber jobs. She had a pulp mill, she had sawmills, she had other timber-related issues in her district. So it was quite an interesting time, but I will say the first time I heard about forest and fish was in the fall of 1998 when Nels and Chan invited me to a dinner. And they hosted about 8 or 9 of us legislators, both sides of the political aisle, and they put on a presentation that was second to none about why we needed to consider this very important piece of legislation. So from that standpoint, it was the WFFA's leadership that inspired me to get engaged in that bill as one of the sponsors of the bill. It was also some people that were involved in the WFFA that were trying to get me to kill the bill. So this was
some of them are still in the room.
This was, well, I had grown up across the street from Alan Thayer, and many of you probably know who he was. He's a former Crown Zellerback executive, but he had a small tree farm down in Clark County. He came and, like I say, I grew up with his kids. We were very close family friends, and he lobbied me week after week to kill this bill. My own senator, Senator Snyder, who was the Senate Majority Leader from Long Beach, kept telling me, this is just too big of a lift. It's going to be too complicated. It's going to make our industry put our industry in a very tough spot. But the negotiators of the Forest and Fish, including Chan and Nels, convinced me that the risks of ESA and not having stability in our forest practices was a greater risk. So we were able to convince Sid to eventually vote for the bill. That's, I guess, enough for me. There's a lot of other history, but that's my perspective in 1999.
Thank you. John?
Ken, you already lost control of the panel, so you're right. Thanks. So I'm John Mankowski. I had two roles, the privilege of playing two roles in the Forest and Fish Agreement. First of all, I was hired on with state government with the advent of the TFW agreement back in '87. So I came into state government sort of with a mentality of collaboration, working with tribes, forest landowners, agencies to try to get things done. Sort of that tough intersection between bringing people together across disciplines and across geographies to tackle environmental challenges. So when ESA listings came up for salmon, a couple things happened. We understood that we didn't want to repeat the top-down, federal-driven approach of spotted owls. With all due respect to the federal folks in this room, that wasn't easy for us, and it was difficult. We think we know that the local state-based solutions are far better. So with the advent of salmon listings affecting potentially 75% of the state, we sort of had a common cause. I remember Bill Wilkerson saying, and Billy Frank saying, we need a state-based solution. We can come up with a better solution that works for Washington, building on TFW, and developing our approach to salmon recovery through forest and fish. And so I was at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I was the Special Assistant for Environmental Policy in that agency and helped lead a team of scientists and biologists in that agency to negotiate and build forest and fish. And then I had the privilege towards the end in 2006 of working for Governor Gregoire. And we actually held the signing ceremony on Ken Miller's tree farm. And it was a major event. It really struck me, and it struck the governor as well, in terms of really understanding what small forest landowners are about. Their lighter touch on the land, their commitment to intergenerational ownership of that land. And I think that carried on through Governor Gregoire's administration. She worked hard to make sure that Forest and Fish was funded over time, both the small landowner elements and the adaptive management and tribal capacity as well. So those were my points of engagement, and I'll just kind of fast forward and say, when I look back after 20 years, I still highlight Forest and Fish as one of the more significant conservation events that I've been part of, and I'm proud to have said that.
Thank you, John. Cassie?
Well, the short answer is I was one of the negotiators at the table. I worked for Weyerhaeuser at the time, and I represented the company in work in Washington and Oregon. But like everybody else, I have to use a little more time, and I want to go back and just make the point that Forest and Fish was the culmination of a lot of very big forces that were in play affecting forestry, especially in the Northwest. And I go back to the mid-'70s. I graduated from the UW Forestry School in '76, and the Clean Water Act had been adopted in, I think, '75. The ESA had been adopted around the same time. The State Forest Practices Act was adopted in '74, and I think the rules, so the Clean Water Act must have been '73. And then the rules adopted, I think, in '75. And then I went to work as a young forester for the state of Washington, and my job was to implement the brand new State Forest Practices rules on Weyerhaeuser, ironically, land and the Snoqualmie Tree Farm, which is a whole other set of stories. So immediately, oh, and the other thing was the Bolt decision. So the Bolt decision was in 75, 70, I've got it, 74. So you had a huge amount of, forces in play. They had yet to play out, but a lot was going on. I'm working as a young forester. I'm immediately completely confounded and intrigued by all of this. So after a few years, I went back and went to law school, and then worked in the Senate, and came back and practiced law. And then, in the meantime, these laws have started to engage. The Bolt decision had played out in an interesting way because the tribes the Bolt decision always included what we called Phase 2, which was a right to environmental encumbrance or a right to good environmental performance, so that there would be fish, so that the tribes could realize the Bolt decision's recognition of the right to 50% of the harvest. Phase 2 had been moving through the federal courts. I actually wrote a paper on it in '86, and I can give you a copy if you'd love it. and culminating in, for our industry, our sector, the decision to form TFW and negotiate our way through these difficult issues. The Bolt decision, or phase 2, laid pretty quiet then for a number of years, 15 or so years, and then the tribes re-engaged it against the state in 2001, I think, and that ended up being the Culverts case, which was in the Supreme Court just last year. So it wasn't as if Forest and Fish was happening in a void, and I think for some of your members who find it difficult, it is a very expensive agreement. And I'll talk later about what I think the trade-offs are, but it wasn't like it was just out of the blue. There were big forces at play. The spotted owl, I joined Weyerhaeuser in 91. The spotted owl was listed in 90. I joined them in 91. The state, you were all in the midst of another massive set of negotiations. I can remember my first Forest Practices Board meeting I went to in the summer of 91, it must have been. It was at Bellingham. And I remember sitting through it, going back to my car in the parking lot and crying. Just crying because it was like, why did I take this job?
We still do that.
So we ended up negotiating in TFW a spotted owl rule, but in the meantime, fish had been listed, and the agreement, and the federal agencies were at the table, and they had agreed that they would recognize that rule if it was a consensus that they supported under the ESA. But when it came time for them to act on that, fish had been listed in the meantime, and so Bob Turner, who was had a role in NOAA Fisheries, wrote an infamous letter to Jennifer Belzer saying, "Oh, sorry about that." Actually, he wrote it to his counterpart at Interior saying, "Oh, sorry about that. I know you guys thought you'd be able to follow through on your spotted owl deal, but guess what? We won't be able to sign off on the fish part of it under the ESA unless you all go back to the table and negotiate a fish deal." So that's what we did. That's what the impetus of Forest and Fish. We basically had to go back to the table or lose all the work we'd done, and we. So that's where I was then, and that's many of us spent 2 or 3 years of our lives.
Okay, thanks, Cassie. Jim?
Thank you very much. Well, my role in the negotiations, I was representing the Squaxin Island tribe in those negotiations, and one of the key issues, at least for me and a lot of the tribes, is to continue the foundation of timber, fish, and wildlife. One of those which all of us gave blood at, creating those ground rules and things back in the day, we're working. But unfortunately, we had this ESA thing, and then Water Quality Act started coming up in our negotiations too. And so we had to kind of deal with those things collectively. And by using that foundation of the TFW process, I think that was gave us the capabilities to continue that work and to listen to each other to come up with the forest and fish rules. Now I have to say that the tribal participation started out with, at least in the Western Washington tribes, which are covered from the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, are 20 treaty tribes. We probably started out with probably about 11 or 12 full-time participants in those negotiations, and towards the end we only had 5. And that was kind of unfortunate, and it was kind of tough for the ones that were remaining on the tribes to, when we got this agreement, to go back and get support. It was tough, and it took us a while to persuade the people that actually left the process that this was something that we need to deal with. If not, we could, the years of effort of everybody in the room on TFW were probably going to implode. And so we got agreement from the rest of the tribes to go forward and support the legislation and eventually the HCP. Now, there's some stuff that went on with the legislation that weren't negotiated in the original agreement, but that's just the way. And some of those were actually benefits to the small forested landowners, which the tribes did agree to. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, our type of thing. One of the things to understand is you might all hear about the tribe's government-to-government relationship with the state of Washington and the federal government, the co-management relationships that we have with the state of Washington also. But in this situation, we don't use those type of terms because this is an agreement that is outside our tribal government's philosophy when dealing with protecting our treaty resources. Since we had this agreement, and since it was tied with the Timber, Fish, and Wildlife program, we continue to sit at the table and work these issues out and listen to each other and try to solve each other's problems at the same time looking at the benefit of both salmon recovery and meeting the Clean Water Act.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know if you all caught the similarities that Jim described. The processes that he goes through working with all his several tribes is very similar to working with small forest landowners. We all have our own opinions. It's a little bit like herding cats at times, but we're all motivated by the same things. So in our community, we continually hear science debates amongst our group, none of which are science-related folks. So could any of you speak to the role of science versus negotiation versus shared risk that came to play in the final deal? Would anybody volunteer to speak up to that?
I'll go ahead and start since I have the mic. Now, understanding I'm not a science person, I'm a policy person, but from starting off again with the foundation that TFW had set forward for us to work on is science is to be used to help us do the right thing out there and to protect the resources that we need. And then also then at the negotiation part, as that's at the policy. Negotiations at the science part, it needs to be true science. We have a system that's set up. Sometimes it drags on, but I think everybody in that process agrees with it. And sometimes it actually works fairly well, and we get we meet our deadlines. We agree collectively to extend those deadlines a little bit. But when it works very good, and we have 100% support going forward. When it doesn't and it drags on, it gets frustrated, and that's where policy steps in. And even if it goes all the way through, it's the policy group that now has the responsibility to implement that information that we got from the scientists. So that's where the negotiations start, is how do we implement this? And we then have to figure out the impacts to the forest industry, the impacts to the resources, and that's kind of where we have to work those things out, continue to meet our goals of protecting both the resources and making sure that we have a viable timber industry out there also. When it comes to the risk, it's basically it's a balancing act of those risks. Unfortunately, right now, we're not really balanced too well. We're not recovering salmon. We're in a lot of cases, we're not meeting the Clean Water Act. And hopefully with some of the studies that have become a priority for Forest and Fish on the Clean Water Act assurances, that will actually tell us what we need to do in our next steps. But we have to be very disciplined to make sure that we get those done. And we've been fortunate, actually unfortunate, that all of us on the table dropped the ball in the first 10 to 15 years that we were supposed to get this done Fortunately, the Department of Ecology gave us some extra time to deal with that, and that deadline's coming up. And so we'll have to do our job to make sure that we're showing them that we have that and we're dealing with it, and we need to show them that we have actually done some very good things and implement some stuff dealing with this, and we still have some studies coming forward. One of the things that I continue to talk about, I'm a tribal fisherman. For me, unfortunately, I haven't been able to fish for the last 3 to 4 years. And part of that was my own reasoning. I have younger nephews and stuff that I go ahead and let them use my boat to go ahead and do that. The last 2 years, I haven't even charged them to use my boat because the harvest has been so low. The last 3 or 4 years, fisheries have been cut back collectively from recreational, treaty fish, commercial fishing, and also non-treaty commercial fishing to almost below 80% now. And so hopefully we have some more advocates out there in the fishing community to come and be able to educate our legislators on the importance of protecting habitat. And that's one of the things that I always continue to talk about is the timber industry, the small forested landowners have already done that and is continuing to do that, and we need to look downstream and make sure that other industries step up to the plate and cover their responsibilities on protecting this valuable resource.
Thanks, Jim. Anybody else have comments on that subject? How did we end up with one tree length, for example? Is that science-based, or just pick out of the air, or where did that come from?
I know where that comes from. First, I want to say that the role of science and good science is absolutely critical to this whole series of negotiations to TFW, and I think the fact that TFW had this cooperative science program is a big part of why Forest and Fish exists and why it works and why it has the stability it does. When I hear people say, is it science versus negotiations, that troubles me a little, because science provides information, right? It provides data, it provides analysis. And what we want from science is input to policy and management decisions. Science doesn't give you the answer. Science shows you the shape of the curves. So in this case, it was great because they had these, we call them FEMAT curves, right? So if any of you remember, there are these curves, and so you've got distance from the stream, and you've got a curve that zooms up, and this is impacts of shade, large woody debris, nutrients. It zooms up and then flattens out. So what that tells you is, it tells you, what's the benefit of different buffer widths. And it tells you that in the first, 50 feet or so, there's a huge amount of benefit because these curves are all just zooming up. And then it flattens out. The Forest Service making the same decisions, decided that science should give them the answer, I guess, somehow. And they went way out onto the flat part of the curve and picked a buffer width out there, their famous 300-foot buffers. And they had a theory that they could then ratchet back based on site-specific information, but they misunderstood our legal system and misunderstood that they would be challenged at every point, and they would have to be proving the absence of harm, which is, intellectually or philosophically almost impossible. So they were never able to cut back those enormous buffer widths. So what we were doing was to bring the science to bear, the different data behind the shapes of those curves, and understanding, and then negotiating, because that's data, that's science. The question of where should you be on that is a policy decision that has to consider costs and job impacts and land taken out of production, all these other factors that you don't want to make that the scientist's responsibility. You don't want to say to the scientists, tell us how wide the buffers could be, because then you're taking all these other things that are not part of their training or skill set, and you're putting those on their shoulder, saying, oh, hey, by the way, figure that stuff out too, but implicitly, not explicitly. It's just a complete mess. It's not the way to do it. And we didn't. And so we did negotiate the buffer width, and based on the science, the tree length is where the scientific models show you that you get most of the large woody debris. We actually created an interesting computer model on that. And then, and you know, the Forest Service ended up at 2 or 3 tree lengths. A negotiation could get you there. The science is neutral on where you are on that, but the science tells you what the relative benefits and benefits are, and then you have to negotiate over the cost. So I would argue it's a highly scientific-based negotiation, but yes, it's a negotiation.
And believe it or not, in our board meeting yesterday, we actually talked about the FEMAT curve. So, and the context there was in our Small Landowner Advisory Committee meetings for the last 2 or 3 meetings, we've been trying to figure out how to characterize what the legislature meant by relatively low impact. And it's somewhere on that FEMAT curve, and we're really struggling with how to figure it out, and probably because that ultimately is a policy question, not a science question. John, or you have a comment on the risk or
Cassie
science?
covered some of the main points. I won't repeat them, but just recall from the state perspective, coming in on the heels of the Northwest Forest Plan, when Judge Dwyer had the injunction on timber harvest. You know, there was the federal aquatic conservation strategy, late successional reserves, pretty bold conservation strategies, but they applied to federal lands. So the challenge that agencies and others were faced with, how do you achieve resource conservation in a private land perspective, where you have property rights and the need to maintain access and management of those lands. So there was some science that applied to that, as Cassie pointed out, but there are also some risks, some places where people were being asked to buy into certain assumptions. And that's really where the adaptive management program, you know, provided the breakthrough. Without the adaptive management program, I don't think this deal would have been a deal. There's got to be a way to handle that uncertainty. And so 2 things. One is we have kind of an organized approach to handle that uncertainty through the adaptive management program. It's kind of a blessing and a curse. It seems like it never ends. But it is a design to, you know, adapt to change over time. But also, kind of the curse is, it seems to be, after 20 years, focused on just a narrow suite of things, right? We don't ask ourselves broader questions. Are we still maintaining working forest lands? You know, how are we doing with the relationship of the participants? That seems to be sagging. Do we still have kind of a common cause to come together to work on these things? Adaptive management system wasn't designed to do that well. And that seems to me, from my kind of outsider perspective, where the system could use some more assistance. We're pretty good on measuring science and data, and we can argue about that forever, and we probably will. But we need to step back and say, while we're arguing about one leg of the stool, what if somebody sells the house? You know, do we still have lands to work with?
Right. Thank you. Justin just gave me the 10-minute clock, so we'll, if Mark, if you want to finish up any thoughts on that, but I would like to give everybody a chance to comment, you know, if you had a do-over, anything you might want to do a little differently.
Well, I'll try to combine the 2 questions then, and maybe the third one there. You asked about if there were any memories that small forest landowner leadership came to mind. Well, one came actually a year or 2 later. We were still in the tie legislature. And Representative Bob Sump was my co-chair of the Natural Resources Committee, because I was then the chair, co-chair of the Natural Resources Committee. We had an election. Jennifer Belcher decided not to run for re-election, and Doug Sutherland was the new lands commissioner. And he had been over in eastern Washington up toward Republic or Colville, and over 1,000 people came out, led by small forest landowners. And one of those small forest landowners is now a state representative, Joel Kretz. And he was probably one of the loudest in the crowd. He was one of the organizers on the RMAP issue, and the triple F2P came out of that. Bob Sump called me on the phone after that meeting, and he had a little bit of a southern drawl, and he said, "Mark," he said, "I thought they were going to lynch Doug." And he was very worried about this uproar in his community. And so we went to work during that interim to figure out, with small forest landowners, we actually brought Mr. Kretz over to speak to the leadership of the legislature, the House, the Senate, and the DNR. And we devised the bill that came out as the FFF2P. And as things go, one of Senator Rolfus's predecessors, Phil Rockefeller, was my vice chair, and he sponsored that bill to do that. So that was a recollection for me. What would you do over? From my perspective, you know, we worked hard to try to find balance, and it's a very tough set of circumstances. You've got economics, you've got environment, you've got fish. I would say the one thing that we should seriously look at is what Jim said in the last part of his last comments, is under that administration, under Gary Locke's administration, he had about 4 or 5 modules for salmon recovery. The forestry module was one. And I would say that 20 years later, we're 95% complete. We're almost 90% done on the RMAP, over 7,900 construction projects done in the woods to repair our culverts at a tune of over $320 million. We've got buffers on our streams. Fish can survive there if they can get there. But to Jim's point, last year in the U.S. Supreme Court, the state on its state-based culverts on DOT's highways around Puget Sound identified over 800 culverts that are blocking fish passage just in the Puget Sound region. And they've got a court injunction, federal court injunction, to solve it. And I know the legislature's working hard to put money into that, but they've got about a 15-year time frame now, not 20. It started out at 17 years, and a couple of years have rolled off of that clock. So that's very serious. The cities and the counties need funding to replace their culverts. I know Eric is here. He's going to talk about this later. We need to join as a coalition to assist other parts of the watershed in doing the right thing. And I'm very proud of the timber industry, small and large, because we're not perfect. We haven't completed 100%, but we're in the 85 to 90% completion compared to anybody else. We're so far ahead. It's discouraging because the fish can't get to the habitat we've created.
John, any wrap-up?
Yeah, only 2 do-overs for me on my list that haven't already been covered. One is we got 80 to 85% of it right, and I would absolutely do it again. The relationships with the non-industrial landowners were supremely important, and I benefit from that even today. Do-overs, number 1, we should all have worked harder to celebrate successes and maintain common cause. We sort of lost that. Why are we in this together? And we fight over some of the minutia, and we could be losing, some much bigger pieces. So fight harder to celebrate successes and maintain a common cause. And secondly, it's, everybody's job to help everybody else solve their issues. So this report card you gave, the post-legislative report card, not just forest landowners should react to that, but so should the state agency caucus and the tribal caucus and others. Why is this happening? Why are we letting these folks down? Why aren't we working harder to maintain working farms and forests in Washington State as we continue to maintain the adaptive management program? But I just think we got to step back now and then, look at the bigger picture, and make sure we're as committed to solving problems at that scale as we are on the adaptive management pieces.
Thank you, John. Cassie?
Well, there are probably lots of details I would do differently, certainly less complex, but on the positive side, after working on forested fish, I went on in Weyerhaeuser to work more at the national and the international scale. So I had a chance to travel to a lot of the places in the world, the competing regions that produce a lot of timber, including the Nordic countries and Brazil, and of course all through the U.S. South, and continually relearn that our practices here are the best in the world for a place that's still attracting investment in forestry. We have the toughest forest practice rules. You're right about the cost. You're right to groan a little about it. But we're also we still have a viable industry. We still attract investment. And for, the importance of our region, how well we grow trees, how difficult it is given the strong urban presence. I mean, it is quite a set of challenges, and we should be really proud of how we've handled it. And it comes back to this unique combination of this consensus process. The role of the tribes is critical in it. It would not exist but for the tribes. And the state agencies, I give them enormous credit for being willing to tolerate. There could have been, and the federal agencies, much worse interagency battles. I mean, things came together in ways it's a little hard to pinpoint why, except I have to attribute a lot to just personal leadership, Billy Frank and leaders in the industry, and Mark and his predecessors. So we shouldn't forget what an extraordinary thing it is, and doesn't mean it can't be improved, but we should be celebrating that.
Thank you, Cassie.
Real quick on the 2020 hindsight type of thing, I think for me it would to have set up a process to keep our principals involved in the Forest and Fish agreement. They were involved, they were part of the process in Timber, Fish and Wildlife. When we transferred over to the Forest and Fish agreement, we still had a policy, but it was more of a mid-management staff type of role that was being played, and then we continued on with the science part of it too. And my memory of those principles during the TFW process, I was one of them, and when one of my scientists or policy people stepped out of line, it was my job when I heard that to go and call their supervisors and said, get them back in line. And so I did that a number of times, and I know personally, because of the phone calls that I made to the industry and even the smalls, that they brought their people back in line at the other levels. And so I think we're trying to get those engaged. And when I'm talking about principles, I'm talking about the very high management level in the industry, and things like that. The directors and the lands commissioner on the state side of things, and then tribal policy people, their natural resources directors, and maybe in some cases they're elected officials that have that background. So that's what I would have changed to do. The other part that I would have wanted was to try to have a mechanism for us to work together and force the state to fund these programs that the adaptive management program and the participation grants program adequately. The programs that we've set up and everybody have supported for the small landowners to get their culvert and road inventories done, and some of the other programs that are available to you, they're very adequately funded right now, and so we gotta go forward. And then just in closing, my final thoughts, we just need to, we need to set up again, and this goes back to us collectively on a regular basis, and I'm talking about not just in the legislative session timing, but during their off seasons, the coming out and reaching out to our representatives and senators to educate them on this. When I was working on the surcharge for the participation funds, I was very surprised on how many of the representatives that I talked to and the senators that I talked to had no idea what this was all about. And so collectively, us being able to go out there, going to their home districts, talking with them together and educating them, I think in the future budget type of stuff coming forward will be a lot easier for us to do. A couple really quick thanks I want to do is, first of all, thank all of you guys out there that are tree farmers. Continue to do that. I know this process is very frustrating. You're a key part of this program, and I've actually had friends that are interested in purchasing timberlands, and I said, and part of it was just because they like trees and stuff like that, but part of it was actually as an investment. And they're having difficult times trying to find tree farms to buy. So thank you guys all. The other thing I wanted to thank is I just want to thank Ken, your guys' policy representative, Ken and Steve. They do a great job representing you guys. I can relate to them because there's so many of you that they have to come back and talk to, because I have to go back to my tribal governments and talk to them. And so I just want to put my hands up to you two for
Thank you.
speaking out.